The Red Ball Express. How American truckers won World War II. They called it the Blitzkrieg in reverse. While German generals sat in their war rooms confidently analyzing maps of France, calculating fuel consumption rates and supply line vulnerabilities, they made a fatal assumption. American logistics, they concluded with barely concealed amusement, would collapse under its own weight. The United States military, in their assessment, was nothing more than a bloated amateur operation, long on resources but catastrophically short on the discipline and efficiency required to maintain a modern mechanized army across the devastated landscape of post-invasion France. They had charts. They had statistics. They had centuries of Prussian military science backing their conclusions. What they didn't have was any comprehension of what was about to roll across those French highways. August 1944. The beaches of Normandy were secure, but that victory had created a problem of staggering proportions. General George S. Patton's Third Army was tearing through France at a pace that shocked both allies and enemies alike. This wasn't the cautious, methodical advance that military planners had anticipated. This was Patton unleashed, and he was moving so fast that his tanks were literally outrunning their fuel supplies. The British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, never one to praise his American counterparts, watched with grudging amazement as Patton's columns devoured mile after mile of French countryside. But there was a catch, and everyone knew it. An army doesn't run on courage and determination. It runs on gasoline, ammunition, food, replacement parts, and thousands of other items that all have to arrive at the right place at precisely the right time. The situation was dire in a way that would have delighted those German generals if they'd fully understood it. Patton's advance had taken his forces nearly 400 miles from the Normandy beaches. The Allies had anticipated capturing the deep-water ports along the French coast, Calais, Boulogne, Le Havre, facilities that could handle the massive cargo ships bringing supplies from America and Britain. Instead, those ports remained in German hands, or had been so thoroughly destroyed in the fighting that they were useless. Everything, and I mean everything, still had to come through the artificial mulberry harbors and the beaches of Normandy. Then it had to be transported hundreds of miles to armies that were consuming supplies at a rate that defied every pre-war calculation. Let me put this in perspective for you. Patton's Third Army alone was burning through 400,000 gallons of fuel every single day. 400,000 gallons. That's enough to fill about 15 tanker trucks per hour, every hour around the clock. And fuel was just the beginning. His army needed 800 tons of ammunition daily. They needed food for hundreds of thousands of men. They needed medical supplies, spare parts, replacement weapons, tires, batteries, oil, grease, and 1,000 other items. Every single one of those items had to travel from a beach in Normandy to the front lines, which were moving farther away every day. The conventional supply system was designed around railroads. Armies had relied on trains for moving bulk supplies since the American Civil War. The problem was that the French rail system had been systematically destroyed, first by Allied bombing to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy, then by the Germans themselves as they retreated. Tracks were torn up. Bridges were demolished. Rail yards were smoking ruins. The few trains that could operate were nowhere near sufficient for the army's needs. Someone, somewhere, was going to have to come up with an alternative, and they were going to have to come up with it immediately. Enter Colonel John H. Critchfield and his team of supply officers who, in late August 1944, pulled off what might be the greatest logistical improvisation in military history. They created the Red Ball Express, named after the railroad terminology for high-priority freight trains. The concept was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. They would create a dedicated highway system, a loop from Normandy to the front and back again, and fill it with trucks. Not a few trucks, not even a lot of trucks. They would fill those roads with an endless convoy of vehicles moving supplies day and night, creating a mechanical river of logistics that would flow continuously toward Patton's advancing army. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operations. The initial fleet consisted of nearly 6,000 trucks, driven by approximately 23,000 men. The vast majority of these drivers, roughly 75%, were African American soldiers from the Transportation Corps. This detail matters, and we'll come back to it, because these men were about to do something that would fundamentally challenge the racial assumptions of 1940s America, while simultaneously keeping the Allied advance from grinding to a complete halt. The rules of the Red Ball Express were simple but absolute. The designated highways were one way, with separate routes for trucks heading to the front and returning to the depots. No other traffic was permitted on Red Ball routes. Military police were stationed every few miles to keep the roads clear and moving. Civilian vehicles were barred. Even high-ranking officers couldn't commandeer a Red Ball route for personal transport. The trucks moved in convoys, and they moved fast. As fast as the roads and their cargo would allow. Drivers were supposed to take regular rest breaks. But in practice, many of them drove until they literally couldn't keep their eyes open, pulled over for a few hours of sleep in their cabs, then climbed back behind the wheel and kept going. The trucks themselves were primarily GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo trucks, the legendary Deuce and a Half that became the workhorse of American military logistics. These weren't sleek or comfortable vehicles. They were loud, rough-riding, utilitarian machines with minimal cab protection and no amenities whatsoever. The drivers sat exposed to rain, wind, and the occasional German fighter plane that broke through Allied air superiority to strafe the supply routes. Many trucks were modified with additional machine guns mounted on the cab or cargo bed, but the drivers knew that if they were attacked from the air, their best defense was speed and spacing, not firepower. The conditions these men faced were brutal. The August heat gave way to September rains, turning some stretches of road into treacherous mud pits. The trucks weren't designed for the loads they were carrying. Commanders consistently overloaded them because the need was so desperate. Breakdowns were constant. Drivers had to become instant mechanics, capable of performing field repairs with whatever tools and parts they could scrounge. If a truck broke down completely, it was pushed to the side of the road, and the driver hitched a ride with the next convoy, hoping to find a mechanic and tow truck somewhere down the line. Sleep deprivation became a way of life. The official policy called for drivers to work in shifts, with adequate rest periods between runs. Reality was very different. The front needed supplies now, not tomorrow, not next week. Drivers regularly went 40 hours or more with minimal sleep, sustained by coffee, cigarettes, Benzedrine tablets that the Army distributed to keep men alert, and sheer determination. They drove through the night with minimal lighting, just enough to see the road, but not enough to make them easy targets for German artillery or aircraft. Following the blackout dim taillights of the truck ahead, often at speeds that would be considered reckless under normal circumstances, became their nightly routine. The roads themselves were a nightmare. French highways in 1944 were not built for the kind of traffic the Red Ball Express generated. You have to understand, these routes were seeing more heavy vehicle traffic in a single day than they'd experienced in entire years before the war. The constant pounding from thousands of overloaded trucks quickly destroyed road surfaces. Potholes became craters. Pavement crumbled. In some areas, the road simply disintegrated into rutted dirt tracks. Maintenance crews worked around the clock trying to keep the routes passable, but they were fighting a losing battle. Drivers navigated around shell holes, bomb craters, destroyed vehicles, and the general debris of war. Many stretches of road required convoy speeds to drop to a crawl, which created bottlenecks that rippled back for miles. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because while those German generals were confident about American logistical incompetence, they hadn't considered the cultural factors that made the Red Ball Express possible. The majority of these drivers were black soldiers in a still segregated American military. They'd been assigned to the Transportation Corps not because the Army recognized their capabilities, but because prevailing racial attitudes of the time deemed them unsuitable for combat roles. The bitter irony was that driving for the Red Ball Express was every bit as dangerous as frontline combat, sometimes more so, but it didn't carry the same recognition or respect. These men faced discrimination at every turn. When they returned to supply depots in Normandy, They often found that facilities were segregated, with inferior accommodations for black soldiers. Some French towns, influenced by American military policies, attempted to institute segregated establishments. The drivers of the Red Ball Express had to navigate not just the destroyed roads of France, but also the casual racism of their own military structure. Yet they kept driving. They kept delivering. They kept the Third Army moving because they understood something fundamental. Their performance in this role was a refutation of every racist assumption that had been used to justify their exclusion from combat positions. The statistics they compiled were staggering. During the first month of operations, the Red Ball Express delivered over 89,000 tons of supplies to the front. That's roughly the weight of 890 fully loaded Boeing 747 aircraft, all transported on two-lane roads by men who were working 18-hour days in vehicles that were falling apart beneath them. By the time the operation officially ended in November 1944, the Red Ball Express had transported over 400,000 tons of supplies and had logged over 48 million miles, the equivalent of roughly 97 round trips to the moon. But numbers don't tell the whole story. What made the Red Ball Express work wasn't just the trucks or the roads or the supply depots, it was the culture that developed among the drivers. They created their own support network, sharing information about road conditions, mechanical problems, and the best ways to coax a few more miles out of a failing engine. Veterans taught new drivers the tricks of the trade: how to double clutch a fully loaded truck up a steep hill, how to read the road in near total darkness, which stretches of highway were most likely to be targeted by German artillery. A brotherhood developed, one that transcended even the racial divisions of the era, though those divisions never entirely disappeared. There were also the French civilians, who watched in amazement as this mechanical parade rolled through their newly liberated towns day after day, night after night. Many had lived under occupation for 4 years. They'd seen the vaunted German army, with its reputation for efficiency and organization. Now they were seeing what American logistics looked like when fully mobilized, and it didn't look organized at all. It looked chaotic, improvised, almost haphazard, and yet it worked. Supplies kept flowing, the trucks kept moving, the American army kept advancing. French civilians began leaving offerings of food, wine, and flowers at the roadside for the drivers. Some towns organized shifts of volunteers to help with minor repairs or provide coffee and food to drivers as they passed through. The romance of those interactions shouldn't obscure the reality, though. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel and crashed. Trucks went off the road on sharp curves. Mechanical failures caused pileups. German aircraft occasionally broke through to attack the convoys, and the trucks, laden with fuel and ammunition, became rolling bombs when hit. Exact casualty figures are difficult to determine because many accidents were recorded simply as non-combat losses, but historians estimate that dozens of Red Ball Express drivers died during the operation, with hundreds more injured. Then there was the constant pressure from the front. Patton was notorious for his demands and his complete lack of sympathy for logistical constraints. He wanted fuel, ammunition, and supplies, and he wanted them yesterday. When told that his army was outrunning its supply lines, he reportedly responded that he didn't care about lines, he cared about results. His staff officers would call back to supply headquarters with urgent requests, and those requests would filter down to the convoy commanders, who would somehow have to find a way to deliver even more, even faster. The men of the Red Ball Express knew that they were quite literally fueling one of history's most rapid military advances. The pressure was immense. By September 1944, the operation had expanded beyond anyone's initial conception. The number of trucks had grown to over 6,000. The routes had been extended and multiplied. New supply dumps had been established closer to the front to reduce turnaround times. The system was working, but it was consuming itself in the process. Maintenance couldn't keep up with the wear and tear. Tire replacement became a critical bottleneck. Trucks were burning through tires at an alarming rate on the deteriorating roads. Spare parts were in chronically short supply. Some estimates suggest that nearly 30% of Red Ball trucks were out of service at any given time, waiting for repairs. The operation was also fantastically inefficient in some ways, and the planners knew it. Trucks that carried ammunition and fuel to the front returned empty to Normandy, essentially wasting half of their potential capacity. But there was no choice. The front lines were consuming supplies far faster than they were producing anything that needed to be shipped back. The empty return runs were simply a cost of doing business. Some convoys tried to bring back salvaged equipment, captured German material, or wounded soldiers on the return trip, but the primary focus remained on getting loaded trucks to the front as quickly as possible. What the German generals had failed to understand was that American logistics didn't follow European military tradition. It was born from a different culture, one shaped by the vast distances of the North American continent, by an economy built on mass production and distribution, and by a pragmatic willingness to try something that looked impossible on paper if it might work in practice. The Red Ball Express embodied all of those characteristics. It was inefficient by classical military standards. It was wasteful. It consumed resources at an alarming rate, and it absolutely, positively worked. In September 1944, as Patton's tanks rolled toward the German border, German High Command began receiving reports that should have been impossible. American units were operating hundreds of miles from their bases with no apparent supply difficulties. Their tanks had fuel, their artillery had shells, their soldiers had food. The German analysts pored over their intelligence, trying to find the trick. Were the Americans capturing German supply dumps? Were they living off the French countryside? The truth, when they finally pieced it together from prisoner interrogations and reconnaissance reports, must have been difficult to accept. The Americans were simply trucking everything they needed across a continuous supply line that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The psychological impact of the Red Ball Express extended beyond its practical supply function. German soldiers on the defensive could see and hear the evidence of American logistical power. At night, the sound of truck engines was constant. During the day, reconnaissance teams could observe the endless convoys. German commanders knew that every truck represented tons of supplies they couldn't hope to match. The Wehrmacht was already struggling with severe supply shortages. Their horses, yes, the German army still relied heavily on horses for transport, were dying of exhaustion and starvation. Their trucks were immobilized for lack of fuel. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of everything. By October 1944, the Red Ball Express was starting to wind down, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded in buying time for more permanent solutions. The port of Antwerp in Belgium had been captured, and while clearing the Scheldt estuary would take several more weeks of fierce fighting, the end of the supply crisis was in sight. Additional French ports were being brought back into operation. The railroad system was gradually being repaired. The desperate improvisation of August and September could give way to more conventional logistics. The official end date of the Red Ball Express was November 16, 1944, though some historians argue that the spirit of the operation continued in various forms throughout the remainder of the war. By that point, it had become legendary within the army. The drivers who'd kept it running were exhausted, their vehicles were wrecks, and they'd performed one of the most crucial services of the entire European campaign. And yet, when the citations and medals were distributed, the Red Ball Express received surprisingly little official recognition. This gets to something important about how we remember military history. The dramatic battles get the headlines, the movies, the glory. Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhine crossing. These are the moments that capture public imagination. But wars are won by the unglamorous work of keeping an army fed, fueled, and supplied. The Red Ball Express wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, dangerous, repetitive work. But without it, Patton's advance stops dead. Without it, the German army has time to reorganize its defenses. Without it, the war potentially drags on for months longer, with all the additional casualties and destruction that would entail. The racial dimension of the Red Ball Express story became more significant in the years after World War II. During the Civil Rights Movement, historians and activists began highlighting the contributions of black soldiers in the war effort as evidence against segregation and discrimination. The Red Ball Express became a symbol of African American capability and patriotism in the face of systemic racism. These men had literally kept the war effort moving while being denied basic rights and recognition in their own country. Their service was a powerful argument against the Jim Crow system that would persist for another 2 decades. For the men who drove those trucks, the experience was transformative in complex ways. They'd proven themselves under the most demanding conditions imaginable. They'd been essential to victory in Europe. But they returned to an America that was still segregated, that still viewed them as second-class citizens, that still denied them opportunities based solely on their race. Many Red Ball Express veterans became active in the civil rights movement, drawing on their wartime service as evidence that change was necessary and just. Their slogan might have been, "We were good enough to supply Patton's army. We're good enough for equal rights." The logistics lessons of the Red Ball Express influenced military thinking for decades. The U.S. military became obsessed with maintaining supply superiority, with developing systems that could support rapid advances deep into enemy territory. This emphasis on logistics became a defining characteristic of American military power in the late 20th century. During the Gulf War in 1991, the massive supply operation that supported Operation Desert Storm was directly descended from lessons learned in 1944. Military planners studied the Red Ball Express, determined to create systems that could match its effectiveness while avoiding its inefficiencies. What about those German generals and their confident predictions? By late 1944, with their armies in full retreat, they had to confront the reality that their assumptions about American military incompetence had been catastrophically wrong. The United States military had demonstrated an ability to project and sustain power that exceeded anything in their experience. The American way of war, with its emphasis on overwhelming material superiority, its willingness to expend resources freely, and its talent for improvisation, had proven devastatingly effective. The laughter had died in their throats months earlier, replaced by grim recognition that they were facing an enemy whose logistical capabilities alone were enough to grind down German resistance. In the end, the Red Ball Express operated for 81 days, from August 25th to November 16th, 1944. In that time, it delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, ran approximately 6,000 trucks, and employed close to 23,000 drivers and support personnel. It cost the lives of dozens of drivers, wore out thousands of vehicles, and consumed resources at a rate that seemed almost wasteful. It was noisy, chaotic, inefficient by traditional standards, and absolutely essential. Without it, the Allied advance across France doesn't happen. Without it, German forces have time to establish defensive lines that could have prolonged the war indefinitely. The story of the Red Ball Express is ultimately about ordinary men doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. These weren't elite soldiers. They were truck drivers, many of whom had been civilians just months or years before. They weren't given the best equipment or the easiest assignments. What they were given was a mission that was absolutely critical and a deadline that was impossible. And somehow, despite everything working against them, they made it happen. They kept driving through exhaustion, through danger, through discrimination, because they understood that their work mattered. There's a particular kind of heroism in that, the heroism of showing up day after day to do work that's essential but unrecognized, that's dangerous but unheralded. The men of the Red Ball Express didn't storm beaches or charge machine gun nests. They drove trucks. They changed tires in the rain at midnight. They coaxed failing engines through one more run. They navigated bomb-cratered roads with their eyes half closed from exhaustion. And by doing all of that, they helped win a war. Today, you can still drive some of those French highways that served as Red Ball Express routes. They're modern roads now, paved and well-maintained, filled with tourists and commercial traffic. There are a few historical markers, a few plaques in certain towns, but mostly the physical evidence of that frantic autumn in 1944 has vanished. What remains is the story, and it's a story worth remembering, not just as a footnote to military history, but as a testament to what becomes possible when ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things and somehow find a way to deliver.